The title, a little bit of a lie. We're going to talk about a lot more than a billion downloads today. We're going to talk about closer to 10 and what we can analyze from that data, what we've learned from it. So a little bit just to briefly introduce this. So my name's Avi Press. I'm the founder and CEO at Scarf. We are an Oakland-based startup, so we're local to this area. We deal with a lot of open source usage information, so things like downloads, things like viewing documentation, things like telemetry from code. We work with a lot of companies that commercialize open source, but we also work with a lot of non-commercial open source organizations, open source foundations, et cetera. So I'll talk a little about what the data is and how we collected it. I'll talk a little about the trends and then why you should care. And I'm going to go really fast because this is typically a much longer talk. So the data is from about 2,500 open source packages. It's a lot of Docker containers, it's a lot of Helm charts. There's binaries like GitHub releases, tarballs, these kinds of things. NPM packages, even some Terraform modules are represented in this data. Yeah, like I said, a lot of both. We tried to make this a diverse set, so we have commercial, non-commercial, we have single vendor, multi-vendor, and a lot of this is in open source foundations that you probably know, like the Linux Foundation, the ASF, et cetera. It's about 11 billion downloads. Actually, that number is wrong. It's like more like 24 million anonymized origin IDs, but I will talk about what that is. And then all of the IP addresses, we enrich them to get metadata, and that comes from a variety of different places as well. So how this is collected, largely what this is Scarf is what we call a registry gateway. So we sit in front of your container registry, your package registry, and instead of Docker pull straight to your registry, it's Docker pull yourdomain.com, and that domain would be CNAME to us. We redirect back to the registry. So we sit in between the user and wherever your software is being published. Sitting in the middle, you can collect some of this data and then analyze it, enrich it, et cetera. So it's not just that, there's also other things like telemetry, like we have a JavaScript library that'll send post-installation metrics. But then what we do is we'll process that metadata and then we'll delete the IP addresses. So we're not actually keeping any PII from this, it's all just aggregated metadata that we keep and it's all de-anonymized. Or anonymized, I should say. The volume of this, this says more about Scarf than it does about the growth of open source or anything like that, but this is what the data looks like over time. We've been growing, but also the projects on Scarf have been growing, and so ramps up to, in Q1 we did about 4.5 billion downloads on the gateway. So one thing that's really interesting about this kind of data, and a lot of people building open source want to know this, is how many users do I have, right? These are all anonymous, it's all anonymous traffic, so it's hard to get a sense of what that is. And so we've introduced two concepts of uniqueness. One we call an endpoint ID. This is essentially just an IP address, and we hash it and only keep the hashes. This will undercount in a lot of ways, right? Because you might have 10 different engineers downloading stuff all on the same network. They're all going to show up as the same endpoint ID. An origin ID goes a little bit further, where we also include the user agent and any other identifying headers we might have, hash them, store and keep that. That will overcount in certain ways. If you do a download from a pip client and then a curl client, that's 2 origin IDs, but 1 person. And so having multiple notions of uniqueness is very helpful because you care about different things depending on the circumstance we're trying to assess. Like what is a user actually when it comes to open source usage? And so it's kind of interesting when we think about what the artifact registry actually sees. Most of us, if you published NPM, you get total downloads a week. If you go to Docker Hub, you get total downloads ever. But the registry actually sees also what is being downloaded, but also when it was downloaded, and the user agent, what client downloaded it, and a lot of other HTTP headers and the IP address, right? And it's a lot of information actually. And so some things that we've learned from this, it's kind of cool. Open source is used literally everywhere. We saw traffic from every single country and some very surprisingly remote places, like very close to the South Pole, we are seeing open source downloads from. Very close to the North Pole, we see downloads from. It's kind of cool. Like if you build open source, your work probably is geographically a lot more impactful than you might think. And I think a lot of people go not knowing that. It's kind of cool. Governments around the world use open source. We've seen about 65% of the world's national governments downloading open source packages. I have talked to people who work in the government that assert, no, the government does not use open source, and that is empirically incorrect. The government uses quite a bit, and a lot of governments use a lot of open source packages. We have not seen a lot of evidence of that in a lot of Like Middle and Saharan Africa, we don't see much of that. But like, for instance, Brazil uses tons of open source. America obviously does, but we're an American company, so the data is more skewed towards America. That's just a thing to call out in these results. Any given download that we see, we categorize the IP address into a few different categories. It might come from a business, it might come from an ISP, someone, just like a home Comcast or something like that, government, hosting, and education, like a university. A lot of the traffic is coming from ISPs, a lot of it is coming from hosting providers, but that blue here is business. If you are a founder, if you are a commercial entity, if you are commercializing open source, you're going to care a lot about that blue. Depending on what you do, you might care about that tiny slice of yellow as well. But unless you are doing some kind of tracking like this, you would not know. But if you like to think about open source sustainability, this is a very important graph. We found 1.8 million businesses using open source in this data. So it's 1.8 million leads that can be generated from this in general, right? So that is, we're looking at the number of distinct endpoint IDs in that data. And this is really, really valuable information. And this is key for open source sustainability. 94% of the Fortune 500 is represented. There are a lot of studies that try to get at this number through surveys. And those put the number at like 91%. And one of my points here, one thing that I'd really like to hammer home here is that if you are running an open source community, you can do a lot better than surveys. We are some of the most technologically sophisticated people in the world. We can do much better than surveys. Let's collect this kind of data more automatically. So just about every Fortune 500 uses open source. And if you are building open source, you should be focused on that. When the IP address comes from a hosting provider, we see we see which clouds those come from. If you are wondering which marketplace should I focus on first for my product, I would recommend AWS. Google is next, Microsoft is next, everything else. There's a very long tail of cloud providers. And depending on your business, you might want to care about those, but you should really focus on AWS and whatever your customers tell you. One thing that is very interesting that we've seen move quite a bit over time is container registry share. So when we sit in the middle of a Docker container download, this is the proportion of where we sent that traffic to. This has actually changed quite a bit over time. Anytime we see Docker implement more rate limits on the registry, we see the next few quarters that market share drops as people move to GHCR. One thing, I'm not trying to overly plug Scarf, but one thing that we do is we help you move between registries seamlessly and keep a static URL for your users so you can change registries without breaking things for them. And so that brings a lot of traffic to us anytime that happens, but one thing that's been kind of interesting is that Docker is largely recovered from any dips that we have seen over time as a result of this. And so Docker is definitely the de facto winning standard for container registries, but GitHub is definitely by a wide margin what comes next. A very small percentage of the traffic comes from a VPN. This is the percent of every event that we see that is from a recognized VPN. So that's like one of the more corporate, big corporate VPNs. So out of the traffic that we are seeing, this percent is like all the details are unreliable except for the fact that it is a VPN. Like the location is probably not the real location. But that's sometimes we hear that should be messing up the results, and in reality, it doesn't really mess up the results all that much. Now, this is a very important point here, is that if you are looking at your total downloads as an open source maintainer, you are getting a very skewed picture of how many users you have. If you see a spike in traffic, it doesn't necessarily correlate. And so what we've seen, so the blue is total, and then the yellow is unique origin IDs. And so what we see is that the average ratio of total downloads to unique users, again, users in quotes based on how we've defined that, you're probably somewhere between 100 to 1 and 15 to 1. But it gets as bad as 1,000 to 1, depending on, like, if you do a lot of cloud stuff, like you probably have a lot of CI traffic and those numbers get quite inflated. And so if you want to be really pessimistic and you're looking at how many downloads you've had, cut in 1,000, and that's probably what I would recommend. 100 if you're trying to be a little bit more moderate. This unfortunately, sometimes we have to like deliver really bad news to people. We're like, oh, sorry, you don't have as many users as you thought. And what's really interesting, we've seen some of our users put out studies on this where they had huge spikes in traffic, and it just came from like 2 IP addresses. Broken CI pipelines or these kinds of things really aggressively pulling. And what they saw was actually like a lot of their billions and billions of downloads was actually just coming from 20 IP addresses. This kind of thing happens all the time, all the time. Yeah, unfortunately, this happened just more than we would like to admit. But I think the point here is that if you are trying to make decisions, do not make them purely on your download numbers. They are not reliable unless you couple them with a notion of uniqueness. I don't know if there's any VCs in here, but do not deploy capital based on download numbers alone. This is very important. And so I think a lot of resources have been wasted by not understanding this concept. A lot of your downloads come from automated systems, a lot of them. So we see the ones in red here, so like the Renovate bots, the Scopios, the Uptime robots, the Renovate bots. A lot of your downloads are coming from these automated systems that are just checking for updates. They're just trying to pull and have the latest things. Okay, I gotta get moving really quickly here. Yeah, so I think one thing that we can all learn, if you are developing any kind of system that sends requests and you want to know analytics about them, you can put a lot more information into your user agents. Your future self will thank you. Do what Pip did. Pip does a great job. They put a whole JSON payload about the client in there, and we can do really great things with this kind of information. So if you have a user agent for your system, put more information in there. It's great. People do not upgrade versions like you might expect. Most of the time, if someone downloads your software on a particular version, they will never download it again. Oops, sorry, that is the reality. If you distribute a Docker container, most of the people are just going to download latest, though. So there's like a little bit of a weird trade-off there. So encourage users to pin your dependencies, but also watch how they upgrade things over time. You will be disappointed. And so your security patch that you put out there, most of your users probably don't have it. Okay, last thing here, or close to the last thing about the trends here. One thing that's very interesting is we can actually watch how different companies adopt different technologies through this. And we can do a really interesting analysis on this to actually look at what the adoption funnel looks like for a given technology. And one thing that I thought was kind of cool, and I'm happy to talk about this more later, we can actually see that open source AI projects versus open source projects of another more mature category like databases. If you're building AI, you probably know this, you have a lot of churn. We see this bear out in the data where the churn rates of open source AI projects are significantly higher at every single stage of the adoption lifecycle as we've defined it. Take it with a grain of salt, of course, because this is just one way to frame this, but happy to get more into details later if you come find me at office hours. Okay, why does this matter? A couple reasons. So one, if you are an open source maintainer, or if you care about open source sustainability, you need to care about this data because this data is a very important component into how we can make open source businesses run more efficiently, behave more efficiently, and also commercialize more effectively without reaching for non-open source licenses, which is a very popular topic to complain about, but this is a very concrete thing that we can do to address it, right? If like a lot of people like to complain about the HashiCorps, the Sentries, all these companies, but then also complain when they try to collect some basic data about how their software gets used. Let's be more consistent internally as an open source community. Let's support open source companies more systemically. And if you are running an open source business, you should probably start tracking some stuff. Your business is relying on it probably. And so, yeah, a variety of takeaways here, but one thing, thank you to all the people building open source. Your work has a lot of impact, probably a lot more than you realize, because most of your users are not coming to talk to you. Tracking this stuff, we can do a lot of useful things with it, from helping you maintain your work more effectively to helping you sell your products more effectively. And just especially on the security side of things, keep upgrade patterns in mind, be realistic about how people upgrade stuff. And just in general, I think one way that we can all support each other in the open source world is being more embracing of responsible analytics practices. It's been very taboo for a long time. It's really time for that to end. That's all I've got. Thank you.